Hi there, welcome to episode 3 of Matters in Meaning. And I thought it would be appropriate for today's topic to start with a quote from the book written by George Orwell called 1984. So the quote goes like this: "Now I will tell you the answer to my question. It is this: the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power, pure power. What pure power means, you will understand presently. We are different from the oligarchies of the past, in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resembled ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps they even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just around the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now you begin to understand me." What is your worldview? How does that worldview shape and form your understanding of meaning? In this podcast, we discuss various matters of interest and value. But in the end, we want to know the deeper meaning of these matters and how they apply to the world around us and to ourselves. My name's Jonathan. Join me as I search out deeper meaning and understanding into the matters at hand. So for today's topic, what I wanted to delve into is the fickleness of power. And what inspired this topic was the current relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. I saw a few weeks ago, or what was it, a month probably plus now ago, I saw the initial falling out between the two of them. And then after that, it's since progressed to an apology. And then after that, it progressed to, the attempted establishment or the potential establishment of a third political party in America. And it's just been so interesting to see these individuals who barely a year ago, a little less than a year ago, two very powerful billionaires having aligned themselves for a temporary amount of time because there was obviously interest for both of them in regards to what they were trying to pursue, and then how they achieved that end, and then all of a sudden that alignment must have changed somehow to where now they're enemies in a way. And so what you see with that is the ebb and flow and the fickleness of these powerful relationships, and then also not just relationships, but the pursuit of power itself. And I just thought it was a really fascinating thing to observe, and it kind of started off in my mind a chain of thoughts of thinking, this would be an interesting thing to just kind of do a little bit of research on for myself, and then just as a common man come to a better understanding of what fickleness of power actually looks like, both in historical examples, and then in the end, kind of taking those examples, the lessons learned from those historical examples, and then tying them into the idea of meaning, right, and worldview, and how as a human being, how my worldview shapes and forms my understanding of power and people's pursuit of power, and how that, takes place in light of the assumptions that I make about the world and the universe itself. So I just thought it would be a really interesting topic to dig into. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to start with the idea of the fickleness of power and just kind of, I don't know, call it a general description. A definition is probably not the right word, more of a description. And that is that it refers to the fickleness of power itself. It refers to the unpredictable, unstable, and changeable nature of power. And I think that in our world, the places that we see that most often are in the political and social realms. You can think about people, you think about the idea of cancel culture. How many people were at the top of their game in independent media, and then all of a sudden, they get canceled, quote unquote. And these people who were in a powerful position in terms of, information, all of a sudden, their voice was completely gone, and what was a powerful position has now completely disappeared in a matter of a few days or a few weeks. So, you can look at it politically, you can look at it socially, but It captures the idea that those who hold power can lose it suddenly and often without warning, and due to shifts in public opinion, alliances, circumstances, or fortune. And I think that that's what we're seeing right now in its influence. And I think about maybe even potentially Elon Musk's position of influence and power inside the current administration that may be changed somehow. Now, obviously, I have no idea of the inner workings of what's going on behind the scenes. That's not in any way, shape, or form what I'm insinuating. What I am saying is that just from I don't know, just call it a spitball or an assumption perspective, it would seem potentially that he maybe somehow, some way lost some of the influence that he initially had, or maybe potentially expected as a byproduct of everything that he brought to bear to help with a certain election outcome. And that the fact that that position had changed, or that influence had changed, he found himself on the outs and now finds himself wanting to fight back into that position with the creation of another political party. So the reason I say all of that is I think a really good example of kind of giving credence to this description of what the fickleness of power is, just kind of laying the framework. But also I was looking around and just kind of researching the descriptions or ways of conveying the fickleness of power. And I came across a quote from a book that was called Bleeds My Desire. Now, this book is a novel. It's written by an author and novelist, and her name is Nina Campbell. And in this book, she had a quote about the fickleness of power, and I thought it was great. So I just want to make sure I give credit to her as the novelist and the one who wrote this quote. And that is, power is a fickle mistress, easy to seduce, but even easier to lose. That's how it works. One moment, she is your closest confidant, whispering the secrets of the universe into your ear. I love that. The next, she is your vilest oppressor. And once her ears close to your plights, you are well and truly screwed. And I love that. I love that quote. I thought it was, and I love that line where she quotes, at one moment, power is your closest confidant, whispering the secrets of the universe into your ear. I just love that. I think that that's so true. And I think that there's a lot of examples historically that give credence to that quote and to the point that she's trying to make. So I just thought that that was great to kind of caveat on top of what George Orwell's quote from the book 1984. That's more about just power specifically, not so much about the fickleness of power, but power itself and what the end of power is, which is power. And then I think that Nina Campbell's quote from her novel is kind of taking it that next step of kind of like, okay, power is this, but then this is the next step of the fickleness of power. Once you get that power, it's whispering the secrets of the universe into your ear until it becomes your vilest oppressor. And I think that that's just such a wonderful quote. So that was great. So now moving on to the next portion of what I kind of wanted to talk about as it relates to Donald Trump and Elon Musk's relationship, I thought to myself, let's dig back into history to kind of see, what lessons can be learned about the fickleness of power. Is it something that's, commonly seen throughout history and in terms of historical examples? And as I considered that, and as I got to looking into it, I wanted to make a real quick point and a real quick note, which was, I am not a historian. I know that that's probably pretty obvious. But the reason I say that is I am going to delve into the past a lot. I studied history in college. I was a history major. That being a history major does not make you a historian. It makes you a history major. And there's a significant difference between the two. So I am going to go back into the past a lot, though. Most of the time when I reference things historically, I'm going to take it from a general wavetop perspective. I'm not going to try to dig too deep into topics where you start really delving into, the academic disciplines that would be associated with the information that you're presenting. That's not where I try to go on these. I just try to take, general, historically accurate examples with a broad approach to what I'm talking about, and then hopefully use that as a mechanism for connecting into what the discussion is about, and whether that's a modern day situation or current event or just a general idea or topic as a whole. Really kind of giving credence to the fact that my worldview informs me that there is a very specific reality to the nature of man. One of the arguments that you'll see, not an argument, but statements or points from people in academia, especially as regards to history, is history doesn't repeat itself. Those in the academic world always say history does not repeat itself because the factors that are influencing a historical event will never be the exact same. And that is true. The factors that are influencing something in one situation will never be the exact same. You can just think about that from a people perspective. If one single person is not involved in the next situation that takes place that's similar, that one person being removed and the realities of who that person is, their personalities, their abilities, their capabilities to influence that situation, if somebody else is inserted, that is officially, technically, history is not repeating itself, even if the outcomes are the complete same, because there is somebody else involved helping in some other way. And then you can apply that to a myriad of different things. Economics, you can apply that to, the people in power, the governing structures. You can apply that to the culture that's influencing it. However, there is, in my opinion, a common thread that runs through history, and that is the nature of man. And so even though from an academic perspective, quote unquote, history can't repeat itself, which I get, and I don't want to be rude in my approach to that. I do understand what they're saying, and it is right. However, I think that history absolutely does repeat itself, specifically the reality of the nature of man. And so that's why I love to go back into the past. And that's why I like to use it, because I think it's a really good tool and mechanism for being able to connect it to that reality, which influences and informs my worldview, which then in turn allows me to effectively communicate on the things that I'm trying to convey in this podcast. So I just wanted to do a very brief snippet right there, just to kind of give some weight and understanding to why I like to go into the past, to why I like to use it as a reference point, because you'll have noticed in the last few episodes already, I've only done 3 episodes with this one, and I go into the past on each one, and that will be a common theme throughout. And I just want to let anybody who would care to have a listen knows and understands that's the why, in terms of why I like and prefer to do that. Kind of looking at some historical examples of the fickleness of power, the first 2 that immediately came to mind for me were the triumvirates that took place in ancient Rome. So there was 2 triumvirates. The first triumvirate, which included Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Pompey Magnus. And then the second, which included Octavian, Marcus Lepidus, and Antony or Mark Antony. So each of these had their own pursuits, but inside of each, what you had is you had people who were not natural allies, but actually were adversaries at times, who aligned themselves for a temporary time to achieve a certain outcome that then in the end resulted in fracture in those relationships, because power is fickle. And it changes. It's an unstable, unsteady foundation upon which to build yourself. And so it can rapidly change. And the reason I say that is we'll get into these details and you'll see what I'm talking about. So looking at the first triumvirate, what you had was Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, and Marcus Crassus. So Pompey and Crassus were rivals in essence. And you could use, there's a myriad of things. Like I said, I'm not a historian, so we're not going to go deep into this, but you could even look at a general wave-top example of the Third Servile War. Crassus does the vast majority of the legwork to bring, and that the Third Servile War is the fight with Spartacus in the uprise of the slaves and the slave rebellion that took place. And Crassus is the one who did the majority of the legwork of bringing that rebellion to heel. However, at the end, during that final campaign against Spartacus and his army, I think Lucania potentially would have been the battle. Fact check me on that. But after that battle, it was Pompey who ended up mopping up after the conflict. And from that, he was able to take credit for that victory and was given a triumph as a result of that. And Crassus himself was given an ovation, which is a lesser form of celebration. And so obviously, very clearly, these 2 men are rivals. Now, there's other elements of their rivalry that would be much more pertinent, I'm sure. I'm just simply using that as an example to demonstrate, hey, these 2 guys are not aligned. And, Crassus is the wealthiest man in Rome, more than likely, I would assume. Now, I don't know what, timeline perspective out east, what it would have looked like. Maybe there was somebody more wealthy out east. I don't know. But I would say that it's probably, from an assumption perspective, not far off to assume that he might have been the wealthiest man on the planet at the time, or close to it. And then Pompey Magnus was a great general and was kind of someone who, carried with him the loyalty of the soldiery. And then you have Julius Caesar, who's kind of the glue that holds those 3 together. So these 3 men having political ambitions, one of which for Caesar himself was to gain a consulship. And so he was able to temporarily align these 2 adversaries with his own charisma, with his own capability of being able to hold these 2 together to kind of say, hey, let me be consul, and then I will get your interest pushed through, which for Pompey Magnus would have been a land grant for his veterans and the ratification of the Eastern settlements. And for Crassus, there were financial laws to be passed that would benefit the tax collectors that he backed. And Caesar himself could be kind of the strong man in the Senate and as a consul who's able to push those measures through. I think at one point to the point of intimidation, I think almost to the point of violence. But Caesar wanted a provincial base from which to command armies. Because in ancient Roman politics, success as a military commander went hand in hand in your capacity to climb the political ladder. So in the end, the reason I say all of that is how does that give credence to the idea of the fickleness of power? Well, you have these three men who align themselves each for their own benefit and their own potential outcomes. They do so, they achieve those outcomes, and then inevitably what happens? They separate. Crassus goes off to Parthia and is killed. And then what happens with Caesar and Magnus? And Pompey Magnus, to kind of secure that relationship, married Julius Caesar's daughter. And as she died in childbirth, and there's evidence historically to say that Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar's daughter, I believe her name was Julia, that there actually was a love in that relationship between the two of them. So that was the bond that held them together. That bond broke when Julius Caesar's daughter passed away in childbirth, and then what ended up happening between those two men? They ended up on the battlefield fighting against each other in a civil war. Pompey Magnus was forced to flee after his defeat by Julius Caesar on the battlefield, and he fled to Egypt where he was killed. So you have these three men who align for a certain outcome, and then after they align for that certain outcome, they go their separate ways, and then two of them end up fighting each other again on the back end. I mean, that's literally, it's a militaristic example of what's happening right now with Donald Trump and Elon Musk. It's just so fascinating. And so to jump into the second example would be the second Roman triumvirate, which was Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. So I'll try to be a little bit more brief on this. That last one, that explanation went a little longer than I was hoping for, so I'll try to be a little bit more succinct here. But in the end, what you have is this triumvirate was combined after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and they came together legally, and that's one of the big differences between the first Roman triumvirate and this one is that the first was informal. This one was a formal triumvirate, which was established through a law called Lex Titia or Titia. But in the end, they were going after the Republican resistance, the conspirators that murdered Julius Caesar, and this culminated at the Battle of Philippi in Greece. And so during this second triumvirate, right, you had three different people vying for power in three different ways. You had Julius Caesar been assassinated. The triumvirs, they formed the alliance primarily to hunt down and eliminate the assassins. And then they consolidated power, right, which each member controlled a portion of territory. They kind of split it up into three parts, Octavian in the middle, Mark Antony out east, and Lepidus out west towards Spain. And so each member controlled a certain portion of territory. And then they also, through what was called prescriptions, they were able to then get rid of rivals. And then also, as a result of that, they were able to take control of their lands and property. It was called a prescription list. So after doing all of those things and establishing themselves and getting themselves in a position where they're each maybe considered in a strong position, the reality is that Octavian forces Lepidus out. And then Octavian goes into conflict directly, militarily, with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And this is less Octavian himself fighting it out against these individuals, but more of his right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa. And this kind of culminates at the Battle of Actium at sea, in which Agrippa, or Marcus Agrippa, defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra at that battle. And so in the end, what do you have? You have these three individuals who align together for a reason, who, at the onset is to avenge Julius Caesar and to bring down the assassins and the Republican conspirators. They want to reinstitute the Republic. They want to get rid of, rivals. However, what does it result in? It resulted in Mark Antony having to flee to Egypt as well, where he too dies. Marcus Lepidus is forced out, and then Octavian becomes a name that most people will know, which is Augustus, Caesar Augustus. He ends up not reestablishing or confirming the Republic, but he establishes the Roman Empire. And this is the final transition point from when Rome was an established republic and then now is becoming an empire itself. And so you have in that another example of the fickleness of power. And it's like, hey, at 1 minute, you're connected to these three people, the most powerful people in the world. And in that, you get your political ends achieved. And then after that's done, what ends up happening? You flee to Egypt to get killed, pretty much is the example that you get from those two triumvirates, which is it's just so interesting and fascinating to see that common theme play out. And that's not a common theme separated by hundreds and hundreds of years. You're talking about Mark Antony was one of Julius Caesar's lead generals, or one of his lead lieutenants. So you're not talking about people separated by a significant amount of time. This is literally a back-to-back generational thing, which I think is why it's a really fascinating point to go into. So another example in terms of the fickleness of power. Now, those two are more the fickleness of power as it relates to political interwovenness, agendas, ambitions, kind of more the personal human being element of the fickleness of power. The next one that I wanted to touch on, or the next two really, is more of the fickleness of power as it relates to time. And what I wanted to start with was the Mongol Empire. And so this Mongol Empire, established by Genghis Khan as he unites the Mongol tribes in and around 1206, He's succeeded by his son Ogadai in 1227, who's then succeeded eventually. Now, this is not a 1, 2, 3. There's a myriad of different Khans throughout this process. Some succeeded by regents or their mothers. And then, so in the end, what you have is just, I'm using these three as an example to just kind of give the timeline, but there's more leaders throughout this process. But, Chinggis Khan, his son Ogadai, and then eventually, inevitably, Kublai Khan succeeds as the Khan, who then, at the end of Kublai Khan's reign, you have a breaking of the Mongol Empire into 4 parts. So the reason that I wanted to say this in terms of time is that this inevitably happens between 1206 to the fracturing into 4 different sections is 1294. So you have about an 88-year gap from the time where Chinggis Khan begins the conquest of what would be the known world pretty much. This is carried forward by his son, Ogadai, more specifically by one of his great generals, Subutai, who does a reconnaissance of force that literally goes all the way to Europe. And to the point of crushing what was the vast majority, I don't know exactly in detail. This is where I want to be careful, is not to act like I know what I'm talking about historically. I want to be careful on this, but there was a battle in Hungary, and they destroyed a significant army or a significant force of European knights in a battle in Hungary. And I think that in a book that I read or listened to was that they virtually kind of destroyed the flower of European knighthood at the time. So again, definitely check that or fact check that. But I know for a fact that there was a large battle that took place in Hungary in which Subutai and the Mongols won that victory, which then probably would have allowed them had the Khan not died. And when a Khan died, there was what's called a Kurultai, which all the Mongols have to go back to Mongolia, and then a Kurultai is held, and then a new Khan is affirmed during that meeting or gathering. And so had Subutai not had to have left and gone back to Mongolia, I don't think it would have been that far-fetched to maybe potentially assume that he could have made his way all the way to the Atlantic itself, all the way to Western Europe. I don't think that would have been too close to the ledge to make that assumption. Again, that's a common man, uninformed, not a historian. That's just, general spitball opinion. So take that for what it's worth. But the point of all of that when you're thinking about the Mongols is just think about the fickleness of power as it relates to, in 88 years, you have separated nomadic tribes coalescing, coming to power, and literally having the greatest land empire that the world has ever known. Looking at that from the perspective, I can only imagine what it would have been like if you were inside of that empire. It had to have been unimaginable that empire could have ever fallen. I would assume at the time it would seem that way. And that's for me, that's I think a good warning for me as an American. Virtually since World War II ended and the winning of the Cold War, the country that I live in has been virtually unchallenged. That will not always be the case. It's easy to forget that. We have been a powerful entity in the world, but power is fickle. And one day we won't be. There's a great poem called When the Windlocks Edge the Woods in Trouble. And it kind of has a quote that says, ashes under Urukhan. And this idea that, as history keeps on going, then the tree of man was never quiet. Then 'twas the Roman, now 'tis I. And then one day there will be somebody who, though the Roman might be ashes under Urukhan, one day I'll be ashes underneath the town, the city, the nation in which I live. Just that reality is just it's so obvious, I guess. And so it's hard for me to understand why people lose sight of it so quickly and so readily. However, inside the Mongol Empire, it must have been unfathomable that it would have fallen. Yet, 88 years after the beginning of the coalescing of the tribes of Mongolia, and then the inevitable conquest that took place literally worldwide at the time, in 88 years it fragments into four different sections. And then inevitably within like 160, 170 years, the Yin dynasty established in China by the Mongols is overtaken and defeated by the Ming dynasty. And then you see the other, the 4 other ones that, inevitably all come to an end as well. So what seems like this insurmountable machine, within literally less than 200 years, the greatest land empire in the world has ever known is no more. And what a great lesson for all of us to learn and to keep in the back of our minds. And my hope is that people in power would consider that as well. The next example that I wanted to go into as it regards to the historicity of the fickleness of power is Napoleon Bonaparte. And I think that he gives credence to kind of what the Mongols did in terms of the fickleness of power as it relates to time. This idea that there's this unending hold that one can have on power, and it's just how fickle that is. And Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'm going to be really date specific on this one, because by doing that, I think it gives the most credence to the idea of time as it relates to the fickleness of power in his example. So he's crowned emperor. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte has a very fascinating story. Napoleon's life leading up to this, a lot going on. He's a Corsican. He's not actually French, but through the work of his father trying to, put his children in beneficial positions, he's one of 13 children, I believe. He finds himself, as a result of the revolution that took place, finding himself in the military, and then finding himself as an artillery officer, and then inevitably works his way up into the position where he finds himself crowned emperor of the French, not by the, he finds himself crowned emperor of France by his own volition. It's not because everybody voted for it. But he is crowned emperor of the French in 1804. The Battle of Austerlitz, which is considered his greatest military victory, it takes place in 1805. The high water mark of his empire is 1811. And then he's forced to abdicate in exile to Elba in 1814. So he does make it back from Elba for one final attempt at power, which is then ended at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And then he dies in exile, I believe, on the island of St. Helena in 1821. So 1804 to 1821, right? That is 17 years, right? If my math serves me right. 17 years from the time of being crowned emperor of the French to dying in exile on an island in the middle of the Atlantic, right? I mean, what greater example when it comes to time of the fickleness of power? What would it have been like on a summer's afternoon, the afternoon day in the summer in 1811, as Napoleon was sitting there thinking to himself, no one can touch me. The greatest military adversary I have on this planet is a naval captain by the name of Horatio Nelson. The man doesn't operate on land. You had the elephant and the whale type situation taking place at the time between Great Britain and between France. I mean, there must have been times where he thought to himself, my dynasty is going to last forever. And then look at that. I mean, what a great example in regards to time. So the last example that I wanted to give credence to in terms of the fickleness of power, and more so as it relates to the idea of the unshakability of power and how that's just such a false conception. You have the initial two in the triumvirates, which kind of give credence to the reality of, the human component of the pursuit of power and the fickleness of it. How, people align for a time, but then they don't align. And then at one point they're friends, the next they're killing each other on the battlefield. The fickleness of power as it regards to the human condition and the nature of man. And then you have time, of this idea that, hey, my power is going to last forever, or it may seem like it's going to last forever. Well, 88 years, from the Mongol rise, and then all of a sudden it's fracturing. 17 years for Napoleon Bonaparte. He thinks he's going to be probably the most powerful man in Europe for decades, and then all of a sudden he's dead on an island in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by English guards. And then now we have an example of the idea of the unshakableness of power. And I think there's no better place to look to this example than the absolute tragedy of what was Nazi Germany. So you have Hitler declaring himself Führer in 1934. He invades Poland in 1939, and then France falls in 1940. So the mid-1941s, and this is direct control. This is not proxy influence on other nations, say like Italy. That would just be an example that most people would know, and Mussolini. But in mid-1941, Germany directly controls the following nations: Germany, Austria, Poland, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, and Czechoslovakia. So they directly control all of these nations at the height or the peak of their power in the mid-1940s. Now the decline begins. Nazi Germany is defeated through the Battle of Stalingrad as a result of Operation Barbarossa, one of the biggest land, if not the biggest land invasion in the history of the world, when the Nazis invaded along the Eastern Front and into Russia. And after that, the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944, and then Nazi Germany collapses in 1945. And one of the things that I really took away from a quote from Mein Kampf written by Adolf Hitler, and one of the things that he said, specifically the last word at the end that he uses, and what he's talking about here is three principles of power. That, trying to achieve any one of these instances of power, achieving one or even two of them is not going to be enough. Like, all three of these have to be held together. And this was his pursuit, and it's a lesson learned from the failure of the Nazis at the beer hall putsch, their initial attempt to gain power that failed, and the kind of the lessons learned as a result of that. And taken away from this, I like to give book recommendations because I think that, the term Nazi is used a lot and is a mechanism to vilify other people. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand, okay, like very clearly, we're talking about some of the most evil people that have ever walked the face of the earth when we're talking about the Nazi Germany. And I wanted to better understand what this was, how it came to be. That way, when the term is used as a mechanism to vilify other people, I would be better positioned to be able to understand, okay, that makes sense, or no, that does not make sense. And so I read a book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and it's written by William Scherr, and it is also a great audiobook. It's about 50 some hours, so put on your seatbelt. However, he was an American news correspondent who was working in Germany during the rise of the Nazis. So he literally saw this firsthand taking place. And he talks about in his book how typically you want to give some time before you write about something historically. It's not good for somebody to write about a history that they were living through and involved in because they carry so much bias that they can't look at it, kind of objectively. However, his position being present and able to see so much of it coming to power and see the cultural changes and the influences and everything that was associated with the rise of this evil in Germany during that time. And then also on the back end of the war, there was a massive collection of documents that weren't destroyed by the Nazis at the end of the war, and he was able to attain access to these documents. And so he wrote this book about the rise and the fall of the Third Reich based off of his own personal experience of viewing it, but also based off of all of these documents that he had access to. And it just, if you want to have a good understanding and clarity of what the Nazi rise and fall was, the things that influenced it, all the key players, who they were, the realities of just this absolute evil that came to power. That book is one of the best resources that you can take a look at to help give an understanding to what it was. And then when people use that term to vilify other people, you can then be like, okay, this makes sense. Or you can look at that and realize, okay, that is a relatively uninformed opinion, and I would disagree. And this is why. So in Mein Kampf, what Hitler does is in regards to the reality of power is he says this. He says, the first constant factor essential to authority is popular support. But authority resting on this foundation alone is utterly weak, right? Unstable and wavering. The second element of all authority is force. If popular support and force are formed together and survive for a certain period of unison, authority may then rest on an even firmer foundation, the authority of tradition. Once popular support, force, and the authority of tradition are united in one, authority may be considered unshakable. And if you read William R. Scherr's book, one of the key takeaways that that Hitler took away after the failure of the beer hall putsch was the absolute necessity of gaining power through the mechanism of the authority of tradition. Understanding that, hey, I can't circumnavigate these pillars of authority in the German world, and so I somehow, some way have to come to power through the utilization of these. And then once that happens, obviously the great tragedy that follows as a result of that lesson learned that they were able to apply, which is horrible. But the fact is that what is the last word that he uses? The authority may be considered unshakable. This idea that we are going to be in a position that's going to, as they talked about in Nazi Germany, establish a 1,000-year Reich. This idea of a millennia-long power hold that they're going to keep and maintain on their section of the world. And then what happens? He shoots himself in the head, and his body is burned in the courtyard as shells and machine gun fire and the burning ruins of Berlin are crumbling all around his burned and charred body. Now, obviously, we look at that from the perspective of, thank God, justice is done. A great evil has been removed from the world. However, you also look at that from the perspective of the fickleness of power. I mean, 4 years earlier, after the fall of France, you can see the video of Hitler smacking his leg outside of the train car that was brought to the same point during the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which was an absolute insult to the German nation at the end of World War I. Hitler smacking his leg, thinking to himself, we're the powerhouse in Europe now, and it's going to be that way forever, or for many, many, many generations, right? Walking and parading through Paris and standing in places thinking to themselves, we are here and we are here to stay, right? 4 years later, he shoots himself in the head and his body is burned in the courtyard as literally Berlin burns around him. I mean, what a greater example of the fickleness of power. And then, so what I wanted to then do is bring that whole discussion historically full circle to the current kind of I call it the biumvirate. I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it because it makes sense in my head. So the biumvirate between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. You have two individuals who align because they both understand, hey, we need to align for whatever. And there could have been good motives. There could have been not good motives. I don't know. but you have two people who have aligned for the sake of ensuring an outcome, which was that Donald Trump wins the election. You had one individual who was trying to pursue that in politically. You have another individual who was like, hey, I bring all the resources necessary because I'm the richest man on earth to bear to be able to help bring this along. And so they align and coalesce to achieve that outcome. I mean, think about Crassus, the richest man in the world at the time, or close to the richest man in the world potentially. And then you have him aligning with a power broker to try to get themselves to a position of strength and outcome. However, you have these two individuals who have aligned, and now it's just power is so fickle. And the big thing that I wanted to take away from all of that in terms of kind of the final connecting point, the cherry on top of understanding why all of that matters. And we're going to get into the reality of the impacts and the influence that these people pursuing that power and the impact that that has on the common man. And the way that I want to go through these examples to give credence to that is to just go through the amount of people that died as a result of these people wanting to create unshakable power, these people wanting to establish worldwide dominance, whether that's in the Mongols or whether that's European dominance by Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe, or whether that's through the Triumvirs in ancient Rome trying to position themselves in the strongest possible way to achieve their outcomes, right? What does that mean, and how did that influence the common man? So let's look at that real fast in regards to numbers. So as the Nazis pursued that end, 70 to 85 million people died. As Napoleon Bonaparte pursued that end, 4 to 7 million people died. As the Mongols went across the world, conquering, estimate potentially as many as 20 million people were killed. When you look at the Triumvirs and you look at their attempts to attain power, and you look at Romans killing Romans, and you look at the amount of people that died in that process, you're looking at tens of thousands of people dying. I mean, you're looking at literally, as we go through that, into the hundreds of millions of people. And that's only 1, 2, 3, 4. That is only 5 historical examples. 5. That's it. That doesn't include the impacts that that's having. Think about it from, think about ancient Gaul, right? Before it was destroyed virtually and overtaken by the Romans. Or think about the ancient tribal cultures of Germany, right? Think about these different cultures and these different tribes going through, all right, hey, one gains power over the other, or there's a power broker inside of one of those, and that power changes as another one takes power. And all of the people who then were supporting that previous power head are then taken and removed as that new power comes to place. And how many people died as a result of that change in power? So there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of examples of the fickleness of power taking place, people losing that power that they're trying to hold on to, and then how many people die as a result of that change. Right? We're only talking about 5 examples. Now, these are obviously huge examples, right, throughout history. I mean, the Mongols are a massive example, right? The change in Rome becoming an empire rather than remaining a republic. These are massive historical examples. So I understand that completely. However, we're only looking at 5 examples from history. And how many hundreds of millions of people are dead as a result of that? And so what I want to kind of give credence to is I talk about and discuss this idea of the fickleness of power. There is an inherent reality that accompanies it when it comes to the influences and the impacts that it has on the common man. And so I think that should be a reticent warning and a reality for the application of wisdom, not for fear, not for panic, not for anything like that, right? It's not always looking around, okay, where's power changing and how's it going to impact? That's not what I'm trying to get at, right? It's not sensationalism. It's not fear. It's just learning and understanding and taking that and allowing that to give people the ability to apply wisdom, right? So as we consider that in light of the political realities maybe in America today, right? I think that we've kind of started to notice over the course of the last few election cycles that America is moving towards a more sensationalistic response as power is changing. You think about the dichotomy of power from what the previous administration was doing, and then now what is the current administration doing? Like these shifts that are taking place as power is changing in America are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, which then in turn, in an already sensationalistic culture in which we live, is only going to heighten that. And so if we have enough power changes that go from one side to the other as this continues to take place, inevitably it is going to result in conflict. It just is. It's just the nature of man. It's the nature of the reality of the fickleness of power. And I think that as Americans, regardless of what your political leaning is, I think that that's something to be wise to. not fearful of, not sensationalistic about, just understanding, hey, this is how human beings are. This is how things are going to continue to progress more than likely. And then if it does continue to progress that way, this will probably be the inevitable outcome. And that's something to be wise to. That's something to teach if you have children and then you want to help them learn and grow and educate them in a way. Just these are great examples of, hey, this is what this looks like. Don't get caught up in nonsense. Like these things have been happening for thousands of years. Just these are the impacts that it can have on everyday people like us. And these are things to be wise about. And I just think that that's a really healthy way to look at it and to approach it. So I just wanted to use that as a closing point to give credence to how looking back into the past and looking back at historical examples of the fickleness of power and the impacts that that's had on the common man. And, how we can consider that in light of our own lives and how we can apply that with wisdom, with common sense, not with sensationalism. And then you're just applying a quiet confidence that can be associated with understanding and how, even though everything about how power is shifting and changing in our modern day is different in terms of the people that are involved, in terms of the culture that it is taking place in, the impacts that it's being had or the influences being had on it from an information perspective, a technological perspective, like all of these different nuances and realities that are influencing how these things happen in our modern world and specifically in my culture that I live in. There is a common thread and a common theme that runs through all of that, like I said earlier. Even though history may not quote unquote repeats itself, human nature has repeated itself nonstop throughout history. And so I think that all of these are good things to think about and consider in light of the historical perspective of the fickleness of power. And I look forward to, in the next episode, digging into the kind of the psychology behind this idea of wanting to pursue power, but more than anything, trying to cling on to power, cling on. That's I huge Star Trek fan. So, but people wanting to cling on to power and unwillingness to let it go, and just kind of some of the psychology behind that. And then also in the next episode, we'll talk about worldview and then how one's worldview helps your understanding of power and why people are pursuing it in that light and in that way, and what your response should be in light of your worldview to the reality of power in that light. So I'll go ahead and close this episode out. And again, if you took the time to stop by and have a listen, thank you. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.